Hello, future attorneys! Welcome to the last lecture of our Last Minute Tip lecture series for the 2025 bar exam. In this final lecture, we'll cover both remedial law and legal and judicial ethics, focusing on recent jurisprudence and relevant concepts to help you prepare for the last subject on the last day of the bar. So let's start. Let's discuss first the writ of amparo. The writ of amparo is a protective writ. Its purpose is to extend protection, not to prosecute the wrongdoers. It allows the courts to order immediate protective relief and fact-finding steps in covered cases, especially when these reliefs cannot be obtained quickly enough in regular criminal or civil proceedings. When is the writ of amparo available? The writ of amparo is available to any person whose life, liberty, or security is violated or threatened with violation by any unlawful act or omission of a public official or employee, or of a private individual or entity. Let's break it down. Number 1. The writ of amparo is a remedy available in cases involving violations or potential violations of persons' right to life, liberty, or security. For the violation of other rights, the writ of amparo is not available. For example, the writ of amparo is not available in cases involving the violation of purely commercial or property rights. It is also not available in cases involving the custody of minors. Recall that the remedy in these cases is a habeas corpus petition, and there is a specific rule on the writ of habeas corpus in relation to custody of minors. The writ of amparo is also not a proper remedy to challenge the issuance of a whole departure order, because this merely involves the right to travel, but not the person's right to life, liberty, or security. Number 2. The writ of amparo is available not only in cases of actual violations of persons' right to life, liberty, and security, but also in cases of threats against their life, liberty, or security. In other words, there is no need to wait for actual violation of rights before the filing of an amparo petition, because this writ protects even in cases of threatened violations of the said rights. And number 3, government involvement is an indispensable requirement in amparo petitions. But note that under the rules, a petition for writ of amparo may be filed even against a private individual or a private entity. In these cases, it is essential still to allege in the petition that the private person is acting with the acquiescence of the government, whether direct or indirect. Remember, however, that not all violations or threatened violations of persons' right to life, liberty, or security are covered by the writ of amparo. The writ covers 2 specific instances. First is extralegal killings, and the second one is enforced disappearances or threats of their occurrence. Extralegal killing means killings committed without due process. Within the context of the writ of amparo, extralegal killings are killings carried out by public officials or private persons with the acquiescence of public officials without lawful arrest or trial, or without justified grounds for the use of force. Let's relate this to the justifying circumstance of self-defense. Let's say that a police officer is conducting a checkpoint. A suspect suddenly pulls out a gun and fires at the police officer. The officer shoots back, hitting the suspect and resulting in his death. This is not a case of extralegal killing, but a valid exercise of self-defense. Remember that self-defense is a legal act. On the other hand, enforced disappearances is the arrest, detention, or abduction of a person by public officials or private persons or groups with the acquiescence of public officials, which places the person outside the protection of law. It may be because the state or the public officials refuse to disclose the location of the person or they refuse to acknowledge the deprivation of liberty. Let's look at actual cases. In Deduro versus Vinoya, a 2023 case, the Supreme Court held that red tagging, vilification, labeling, and guilt by association threaten a person's right to life, liberty, or security, which may justify the issuance of a writ of amparo. In this case, Deduro, who is an activist and a former Bayan Muna representative, alleged that he was red-tagged by Major General Vinoya and his subordinate military officials when they identified him as a member of the CPP-NPA in a presentation. Deduro also alleged that the military put up posters with his photo, identifying him as a criminal, terrorist, and a member of the CPP-NPA. Further, that there were instances when unidentified men followed him. Deduro filed a petition for writ of amparo against Major General Vinoya and his subordinates, which the Supreme Court granted. The Supreme Court held that red tagging, vilification, labeling, and guilt by association constitute threats to a person's right to life, liberty, or security. The Supreme Court noted that red tagging is a recognized form of harassment and intimidation. Also, that the posters labeling him as a terrorist or a CPP-NPA member are easily visible in public. This makes Deduro a target of vigilantes, paramilitary groups, or even state agents, thus giving rise to threats to Deduro's life, liberty, and security. In another case, Castro versus De La Cruz, the Supreme Court granted another amparo petition filed by environmental advocates and volunteers. The petitioners alleged that while they were reaching out to communities affected by the Manila Bay Reclamation Project, they were forcibly taken in an SUV, where unidentified men confiscated and searched their belongings. They were also tied up and blindfolded, and their cell phones were turned off. They were then interrogated and threatened until they were forced to execute affidavits saying they were surrendering as rebels. They were then taken to a military camp and introduced to some government officials. And then the NTF-ELCAC arranged a press conference for them to confirm that they were surrendering voluntarily. However, during the press conference, the petitioners revealed that they were actually abducted. They were released to their families. However, they claimed that the threats to their freedom, life, and security continue. This led them to file a petition for the issuance of a writ of amparo, which, as mentioned, the Supreme Court granted. The court found that the petitioners were able to prove their allegations by substantial evidence, such as through affidavits of witnesses and their own attestations, supported by the photographs of their footwear left at the scene of the abduction. The last case here is the petition for the issuance of a writ of amparo filed by former presidential spokesperson Harry Roque. against the House of Representatives Quad Committee. This is in relation to the hearings conducted by the House on Philippine Offshore Gaming Operators or POGOs. Roque here was required to attend and to bring documents such as his Statement of Assets, Liabilities, and Net Worth or SALN to prove that he did not profit from POGO operations. However, Roque failed to attend the hearings and to bring the required documents. Thus, he was cited in contempt and was ordered detained until he complies. Roque then filed an amparo petition. This time, the Supreme Court denied Roque's petition, saying that the writ of amparo is not the proper remedy for contempt and detention orders of the House, since these do not involve extralegal killings or enforced disappearances. Note that this case is already beyond the cutoff for the 2025 bar exam. But just note this since the principle remains the same. The writ of amparo is not available in cases not involving extralegal killings or enforced disappearances. Next, let's discuss the special writs under the Rules of Procedure on Environmental Cases. The writ of continuing mandamus and the writ of kalikasan. The writ of continuing mandamus is available in cases where there is a legal duty or right under an environmental law, rule, or regulation that is being neglected by the public officials charged with the performance of that duty. Or if those public officials are excluding another person from the enjoyment of a right under that environmental law, rule, or regulation. The writ of continuing mandamus is actually similar to the writ of mandamus under the rules of court. Both of them involve the neglect or refusal to perform ministerial duties, or those duties which the public officials must perform under the law, rule, or regulation. They have no discretion not to perform that ministerial duty. But the writ of continuing mandamus does not apply to all ministerial duties. It applies specifically to those ministerial duties under environmental laws, rules, or regulations. The first case where the Supreme Court issued a writ of continuing mandamus is the case of MMDA versus the concerned residents of Manila Bay. This case was decided even before the RPEC was formulated, which formally institutionalized the writ of continuing mandamus in our rules in relation to environmental cases. In MMDA versus concerned residents of Manila Bay, the Supreme Court issued a writ of continuing mandamus against the concerned government agencies for them to clean up, rehabilitate, and preserve the Manila Bay. And the Supreme Court required these agencies to submit periodic reports to show compliance. On the other hand, the writ of kalikasan involves cases where there is a threat or a violation of the people's right to a balanced and healthful ecology that is due to the unlawful act or omission of any person. And there is a threshold in a writ of kalikasan petition. It will be allowed if alleged and shown that the environmental damage concerned is of such magnitude as to adversely affect the life, health, or property of inhabitants in two or more cities or provinces. So what are the other differences between the two? As to the respondent, a writ of continuing mandamus may be filed only against a public respondent, having the ministerial duty under any environmental law, rule, or regulation. But a writ of kalikasan petition may be filed against public officials, and even against private persons. Another distinction is that the petitioner in a writ of continuing mandamus petition must be directly aggrieved. So there is a requirement of direct injury. But there is no such requirement in case of writ of kalikasan petitions. A writ of kalikasan petition may be filed by those directly affected by the environmental damage or by other qualified persons, groups, or entities on their behalf. And last distinction, the writ of continuing mandamus may include an award of damages, but a writ of kalikasan may not. Again, the writ of continuing mandamus applies only to environmental cases. It cannot be invoked in human rights cases. For instance, to compel the investigation of human rights violations in the government's anti-illegal drug operations. This is the ruling of the Supreme Court in Bakirin versus De La Rosa. In this case, a group of concerned lawyers filed a petition for continuing mandamus to compel the PNP chief, the DOJ secretary, and the Commission of Human Rights chairperson to investigate and prosecute alleged extrajudicial killings committed under the government's anti-drug campaign, commonly known as the Oplan Tokhang or the Oplan Double Barrel. They argued that the respondents failed to perform their duties under the Constitution, domestic law, and international treaties to protect the right to life. The Supreme Court dismissed this petition, holding that a writ of continuing mandamus petition applies only in environmental cases. And even assuming that it is a petition for mandamus under the rules of court, it is still not a proper remedy, since the act sought, like the investigation and the prosecution of human rights violations, are not ministerial duties, but discretionary duties which cannot be compelled. The Supreme Court also discussed in this case the requirements before a writ of mandamus may be issued. Number one requirement is that the petitioner must have a clear legal right. Number two, the respondent must have a correlative duty under the law. Number three, the respondent neglected the performance of this duty. Number four, that duty is ministerial, not discretionary. And number five, there is no other plain, speedy, and adequate remedy in the ordinary course of law. As mentioned here, the acts of investigating and prosecuting human rights violations in relation to the government's anti-drug war are discretionary acts, not ministerial. Therefore, the writ of mandamus is not a proper remedy. Next, let's discuss the rule on the liberal construction of procedural rules. This is expressly provided under Section 6, Rule 1 of the Rules of Court, which provides that these rules, meaning the rules of court, shall be liberally construed to promote their objective of securing a just, speedy, and inexpensive disposition of every action and proceeding. However, this is not the general rule. Of course, the general rule is still compliance with the prescribed procedures. But the liberal construction may be invoked in cases of non-compliance if there are valid grounds. These grounds include the existence of special circumstances, the merits of the case, that the cause for non-compliance is not attributable to the party invoking the liberal interpretation, and that this is not done to delay the proceedings, and that the other party will not be unjustly prejudiced by the liberal construction. So this is what you hear lawyers invoke whenever they commit a procedural lapse in the interest of substantial justice. So when lawyers say this, they are invoking the liberal interpretation of the rules. There is a 2024 case that illustrates this principle, the Guzman-Lara versus Comelec. It was decided in August 2024, and it is beyond the bar cutoff. But this is also good to note since this is a landmark case. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that the filing of pleadings by email may be made even beyond office hours, as long as they are completed within the same day. This is an election case involving a petition for the disqualification of a gubernatorial candidate. The petitioner filed the petition via email with the COMELEC at 6:12 p.m. on the day of the deadline. The COMELEC considered that the petition was filed on the next day since it was filed beyond office hours, citing its internal rules. Thus, the COMELEC dismissed the petition outright for late filing. But the Supreme Court reversed the COMELEC, saying that the case justifies a relaxation of the COMELEC rules of procedure in the interest of substantial justice. Note that the allegations in this petition are serious, including massive vote buying and illegal disbursement of public funds. Also, the Supreme Court recognized in this case the realities of modern communication and said that the law should evolve alongside technology. So as you may have noticed, our Supreme Court is very technologically driven. This is evident in the strategic plan for judicial innovations. So I hope you have reviewed again the SPJI. Next, on rules on evidence, competency and credibility of witnesses. Under the rules on evidence, witnesses only has two qualifications. Number one, they must be able to perceive and perceiving, meaning they must have the ability to use their senses. And number two, they must be able to communicate or to make known their perception to others. Also, as a general rule, prior qualification is not required before a witness can testify, except in the case of expert witnesses. And also, prior authority to testify is not required. The disqualification of witnesses are provided by the rules on evidence, such as the marital disqualification rule or those cases covered by privileged communications. Aside from the disqualification rules, other conditions of witnesses do not disqualify them from testifying, such as being a deaf-mute, provided that he can appreciate the significance and the sanctity of an oath, and that he can comprehend the facts he will testify to, and he can communicate his ideas through a qualified interpreter. Also not considered a disqualification are the witnesses' religious beliefs or political beliefs, or their interest in the outcome of a case, or the conviction of a crime, unless there is a law providing for the disqualification. Another, mental incapacity or immaturity is no longer considered a ground for the disqualification of witnesses, and a defendant declared in default is not disqualified from appearing as a witness, although he may no longer participate in the proceedings. In the 2024 case of Bragais versus Tacuyo, the Supreme Court admitted the testimony of a 28-year-old sole witness to the killing of a 12-year-old child. The witness was described as a special child with a speech impediment and some mental deficiency. The prosecution presented a report from the National Center of Mental Health, which stated that the witness has an intellectual disability classified as moderate mental retardation, and that his mental age is estimated to be between 3 and 7 years old. Nonetheless, it is said that he is competent to testify as a witness. The trial court convicted the accused of murder. They appealed, arguing that the sole witness should have been disqualified on account of his mental disability. But the Supreme Court upheld the conviction. The Supreme Court emphasized that a person's ability to testify as a witness depends on their capacity to relay their knowledge. If their testimony is clear and understandable, it can be accepted. Next, under criminal procedure, let's talk about the venue of criminal cases. Criminal cases must be filed in the court of the place where the crime was committed or any of its essential elements occurred, as a general rule, because we have an exception to this rule. Under the Constitution, the Supreme Court has the power to order a change of venue or place of trial to avoid miscarriage of justice. And this exception was applied by the Supreme Court in granting the request of the Department of Justice to transfer the venue of the criminal cases filed against Apollo Quiboloy from the Regional Trial Court of Davao City to the Regional Trial Court of Quezon City. The Supreme Court allowed the transfer of venue as it found compelling reasons, including the possibility of bias in the Davao court and the possibility that the witnesses may not be able to freely testify due to fear and influence of the accused Quiboloy, who is a well-known religious leader and an influential figure in Davao City. Quiboloy was charged with child abuse. Let's now move on to legal and judicial ethics. Note that the bar chair, Justice Amy Lazaro Javier, is the chair of the subcommittee for the revision of the Code of Professional Responsibility. Let's review the responsible use of social media under Canon 2 on propriety of the Code of Professional Responsibility and Accountability. The responsible use of social media are new provisions in the CPRA, which were not included in the old Code of Professional Responsibility. And this is very relevant in today's age of social media. So let's cover the responsibilities of lawyers on the use of social media. Under the CPRA, a lawyer shall uphold the dignity of the legal profession in all social media interactions in a manner that enhances the people's confidence in the legal system, as well as promote its responsible use. The following are considered violations of the CPRA in relation to social media use. Number 1. Making online posts that degrade the dignity of the legal profession or disrespect the law, even if the post was made in a restricted private setting, as long as it is shown to an audience. Next, maliciously posting or sharing disinformation. Next, using fake or poser accounts to circumvent the laws or the CPRA. Another is revealing confidential client information in online posts unless this is allowed by law. And last is communicating through social media with officers of the court, tribunal, or government agencies to influence them in the performance of their official duties. Still under the responsible use of social media is the concept of limited legal service. This is becoming more and more common in social media. So maybe you are familiar with Facebook groups of people asking for legal advice and lawyers in the group providing answers. Or some lawyers who live stream their answers to legal questions of their followers. Under the CIPRA, these are not prohibited. In fact, these are recognized as part of the lawyer's duty to the society and the legal profession. So lawyers may provide general legal information or answer legal questions whether in social media or in other fora. But if lawyers do this under the CIPRA, they are dispensing limited legal service, and thus they are bound by all duties in the CIPRA in relation to this limited legal service provided. Now let's discuss a 2023 case about the disturbing social media posts of lawyers and law professors. In this case, the Supreme Court ordered several lawyers and law professors to explain why no administrative charges should be filed against them in relation to a series of Facebook posts containing jokes and remarks perceived as disrespectful towards judges and demeaning toward members of the LGBTQIA community. In the Facebook posts, the lawyers called the judges bakla or corrupt. In short, the lawyers were making fun of the judges. They even implied that the judges may be interested in the male lawyers. The lawyers apologized and claimed that their remarks were made in private conversations and without intent to degrade the judiciary or the LGBTQIA group. The Supreme Court, however, said that privacy is not a defense, since Facebook or social media activity cannot be completely shielded under privacy settings, as posts may still be leaked or shared. The lawyers were reprimanded and given stern warning. One of them was fined by the court. Note that this case was decided under the old Code of Professional Responsibility, and the court held that the lawyers in this case violated the CPR for behaving in a scandalous manner and for failing to observe respect for courts and judicial officers. But if this case is decided under the regime of the CIPRA, the violation is clear. Under the CIPRA, making online posts that degrade the dignity of the legal profession is a violation, even if these posts are not made publicly but under restricted privacy settings, as long as the post holds an audience. Still under Canon 2, in a 2024 case, the Supreme Court held a lawyer guilty of simple misconduct for committing impropriety when he sponsored the trips of Integrated Bar of the Philippines local chapter officers. A complaint alleged that this lawyer was involved in illegal campaigning as part of his plan to be elected as the local IBP chapter governor. He sponsored trips of IBP officers, and he also gave them cash and gift checks. The Supreme Court found that the lawyer violated Sections 1 and 2, Canon 2 of the CIPRA. Section 1 provides that a lawyer shall not engage in unlawful, dishonest, immoral, or deceitful conduct. And Section 2, among others, state that a lawyer shall not act in such a manner that discredits the legal profession. The court said that the gifts create a sense of obligation on the part of the recipients, and that the lawyers' acts were inappropriate as they raised questions about the integrity, fairness, and independence of the integrated bar. Next is Canon 6 on accountability. This canon enumerates the offenses that can be committed by violating the provisions of the CIPRA. There are serious offenses, less serious offenses, and light offenses. One of the serious offenses is undignified conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice under Section 33I. And in a 2024 case, the Supreme Court found the Chief of the Public Attorney's Office, Attorney Persida Rueda Acosta, is guilty of this serious offense. This is in view of her acts of publicly opposing the new conflict of interest rule under the CIPRA. Specifically, she posted statements on her Facebook page attributing malice to the Supreme Court. She mobilized PAO lawyers, staff, and clients to resist the rule. She also publicized PAO's official letters to the Chief Justice to pressure the court. And she issued an office order implying that compliance with the new rule would expose PAO lawyers to liability and danger. This effectively encouraged disobedience to the new rule, among others. The Supreme Court found Attorney Acosta guilty of undignified conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice. Her acts, taken together, were found to constitute grossly undignified conduct that violated her duties under the CIPRA to respect the courts, to use social media responsibly, and to promote respect for the law and legal processes. And just one last case, this time an illustration of gross misconduct. The 2024 case of Garrido versus Gadon. This involves an administrative complaint filed against Lorenzo Gadon, who was already previously disbarred by the Supreme Court. In this case, the Supreme Court found Gadon guilty of gross misconduct for committing perjury and making hearsay accusations in his verified impeachment complaint against then Chief Justice Maria Lourdes Sereno. Gadon falsely alleged, without personal knowledge or authentic documents, that Sereno falsified a Supreme Court temporary restraining order. Gadon's act deceived the House of Representatives and maliciously damaged Sereno's reputation, and also showed disrespect for the impeachment process. His conduct violated Canon 2, Section 11 of the CIPRA, which prohibits the making of false statements. Note that this case also illustrates the principle that the court does not lose its disciplinary power over a disbarred lawyer. Here, since Gadon was already disbarred, the Supreme Court cannot disbar him again. But the Supreme Court fined him 150,000 and he was held ineligible for judicial clemency. Thank you for listening, future attorneys. I hope this lecture helped your last-minute review for the last subject on the last day of the bar. Best of luck and may you finish strong.